following is my conversation with Andrew Meo. Andrew is originally from New Zealand and was the founder of Rocket Espresso. We discussed Andrew's early career as an auto repair and restoration shop owner, then restaurateur, and eventually how he came to start Rocket Espresso together with his wife, Nicky. We also discussed how Rocket Espresso became a darling of the cycling world and was present in almost every World Tour team's bus, how they grew the brand and eventually exited in 2018. We also discuss his latest project, Box Altitude. My audio is a bit on the lower side of quality, but Andrew sounds great, so please bear with me. Sorry, everybody, for that.
So, Andrew Meo, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate your time. We've had the chance to kind of meet each other in the business. I think at the first Ruler event in London back in 2017 was the first time we met.
Quite likely.
And I've always been a huge fan of your work. I'm friends, and I've always kind of been watching you as an entrepreneur, your products that you've made. And I just wanted to share to my audience and to the people that are interested to kind of understand how you came to be in the cycling business, kind of complementary, and then now your latest adventure as well. So thank you for coming on today.
Thanks, Wyatt. Yep.
So I guess as we talked about, maybe we can start. Tell me a little bit about where you're from, how you started in the business, in the restaurant business. Are you also raced? And then kind of how, I guess we can then dive into rock maybe a little bit after, and then, like I said, your latest venture.
Sure. Okay, I suppose I've had a reasonably diverse life and career, being a jack of all trades and a master of none to a large degree. So I'm a New Zealander. I've been living in Italy since 2007. Very briefly, my background was, I guess, in part a failed bike rider. So I came to Europe as a young guy, 20, and in those days we had amateur and professional ranks as opposed to under 23 and professional ranks, really. And we came as a New Zealand team, and Italy was probably the wrong country to come to for my style of racing, and it was pretty tough. So went home after a decent season here, racing all the major international races, amateur Giro.
Who were you?
Sorry?
Who were you racing for, Andrew?
It was a New Zealand squad at that time, New Zealand team put together. So we raced the amateur Giro, the big Giro della Regione. That season finished with the World Championships, which were in Goodwood that year. Anyway, went back to New Zealand and thought,
so you raced in the World Championships?
Yeah. I've done a world...
So high level.
I've done a world roads and a world mountain bike and a world gravel, actually. So, almost ticked off all the disciplines. Getting a bit too late for track.
Wait, gravel?
Yeah, no, I did the gravel last year and actually finished second in that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, gravel last year and finished second, so that was pretty good.
Cool.
Anyway.
So who did you ride against? I'm just curious, in the worlds.
Well, that year in the professional ranks, Cerrone won the worlds that year. Most of the hitters in those days were Eastern Bloc riders. So because the Eastern Bloc was still the Eastern Bloc in those days, and they weren't professionals. So we'd be riding, and the Russians and the Czechs and the Poles would be on the front, all having this grudge match against one another, with us poor New Zealanders being, strung out single file in the gutter. So, it was pretty tough in those days for...
Well, they had better
Yeah, exactly.
doctors.
But it was pretty cool because you'd be in the hotel with the Russian team, for instance, and having dinner, and they'd be being followed around by these guys in suits and ties, all very secret all very secret service KGB stuff. It was quite interesting. But yeah, that was.
Can you give us an idea what year we're talking about? 70s, 80s?
That was 82. I was here. Yeah.
82.
Yeah, 82. So it wasn't, I think about 84, the Russians became professionals. So it wasn't much later, 83 or 84. It was only a year or so later. Yeah. So then...
So after...
Yeah.
So you had some experience in Europe, and did you immediately have like an idea, like maybe I want to come back here someday?
Yeah, well, I guess fell in love with the country, but then, to be honest, I was probably a little bit biased because I had an Italian father, so he'd been living in New Zealand for, you know, at that stage for 50 odd years, I guess 45 odd years. If I was 20 at the time, so longer. So he was more, well, he was very Italian because he'd obviously grown up being in Italy. But so I guess my childhood wasn't strictly growing up in a New Zealand household. I had an Australian mother and an Italian father. So, and my aunts and uncles, his brothers and sisters, were I guess quite a big part of our extended family. So we grew up very, in a way, partially Italian, you know, in New Zealand, which seems a bit ironic, but you know, so it was pretty cool though. You know, we weren't eating, you know, roast lamb and potatoes. We were eating, you know, spaghetti and grilled fish. You know, so it was, you know, for a lot of my friends that would come around for dinner when we were young, that definitely we had a different lifestyle than most of them, for sure.
Sure. So you had this kind of European influence in your life, but after you stopped racing, when did you begin your professional life? Like, how did you start your professional life?
Okay, so I came back to New Zealand after that season and realised, look, I'm never going to be a professional bike rider. That's, you know, I guess that's every, you know, young cyclist's dream. And I thought, well, that's not going to happen. So I started racing again in New Zealand, and I struggled a bit being back there. The racing, of course, was massively different in New Zealand compared to having come from Europe. And I struggled a bit, and then didn't have a particularly great New Zealand Road Nationals, and didn't get picked, which was basically the basis for all the teams being chosen. And I didn't get picked up on one of the New Zealand teams, which was a bit of a disappointment. So I thought, I'll put my head down and train harder and race harder. But after, you know, it was a winter sport in New Zealand in those days too, so it was pretty grim, to be honest. And I thought, no, I'm packing this in. So then I had a real dilemma, and I was at a crossroads because I'd sort of been doing part-time jobs to allow me to train the way you had to do it in those days. And
how old were you at the point?
I must have been 21, yeah, late 20s. So I was in Europe the year I was 20, but that was the end of that year. So I must have been 20. And somebody offered me an apprenticeship as a car mechanic. And to be honest with you, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I always loved exotic cars. And this opportunity came up in this sort of high-end garage in Wellington. And I thought, why not? You know, let's give this a crack and then see where it goes. To be honest, I didn't even know where the sump plug was, you know, to drain the oil on the car in those days. But I started with these guys, and they were brilliant. And I guess I was lucky in that I found an aptitude that I didn't actually know existed within me, and I became pretty good at it. And this garage was basically, it was called Continental Cars, and it was an importer, franchise holder for Fiat. In those days, Lancia was quite a strong brand, Alfa Romeo and Ferrari. So before too long, I was fortunate enough to be doing all the good stuff that came through the front door of the workshop. So I got mentored by some really clever people and started working on some really, really nice cars. And whilst I guess I was still basically an apprentice at that point, that led to me getting headhunted by a very famous New Zealander, Chris Amon, who was actually drove in Formula One for Ferrari in, I guess it must have been late 60s. I can't remember the year. Anyway, Chris had finished his Formula One career and gone back to New Zealand. He was heavily involved with Toyota, and Toyota set up a division building Group A race cars when Group A was like one of the big newcomers into motorsport. And that was basically hot rod saloon cars, racing for, I don't know how long the races would have been, maybe a 3 hour, maybe a bit longer, more like an endurance kind of track race. At the time, New Zealand had the Wellington Street Circuit, which went through downtown Wellington, which was just fantastic. And all the major European manufacturers would come over, BMW with their M3s, Tom Walkinshaw with his Rovers. There was a Volvo had a Group A set up in those days, so it was pretty phenomenal place to be working and seen to be involved in. And I did that for a little while, and then got asked by the original company that I was working for, doing the Alfa Romeo, Fiat, Lancia, Ferrari stuff, whether I wanted to go into their showroom and sell cars. And so I thought, well, I'm quite young. I'm working all the hours that can be sent on this motor racing project. So I'll go and work for these guys and see how that goes. So I lasted about 6 weeks as a car salesman. I couldn't stand it. It was just horrible. It just wasn't for me. So yeah, got out of that and started my own garage, Officina, at age sort of 21, 22, yeah. And did that for 15 years, built up a really good reputation, again doing European cars in Wellington.
So this would have been repair of Italian cars.
Yeah, repair and restoration. So we had a really good client base, that everything from Fiat, which was bread and butter, sort of through to Porsche, Ferraris. We had a few Maseratis come through, occasionally Lamborghinis, that sort of thing. Some of it was pretty basic service work, and some of it was more in-depth restoration type stuff, or overhauls. And
you had a mechanic shop.
So
mechanic and restoration shop.
Yeah.
And so, why did you get out of that? What was the next step of that?
Okay, in New Zealand, what happened around the share market crash, whenever that was, in the 90s, the market changed in New Zealand dramatically. That sort of discretionary spending that was largely in my business, advertising agency employees, bankers, they basically had a really hard time, and their portfolios just sort of plummeted. And so that a lot of that business kind of really slowed up. At the same time, New Zealand decided it was wise to start bringing in second-hand Japanese cars. So New Zealand was shipping in by the boatload used Japanese cars into the market. What that did is it just brought the whole price of cars, used cars especially, down in New Zealand. And all of a sudden, people weren't prepared to spend money rebuilding a gearbox or rebuilding an engine, and they would just go, well, the car's worth nothing. I'll just, I'm going to put a second-hand gearbox in. So the market changed dramatically overnight, and we started to have a pretty hard time. We went, from sort of more to a hand-to-mouth kind of business, as opposed to, prior to the share market crash, things were really, really buoyant.
Why was the Schumacher crash like a moment that you remember? I don't understand the connection there.
Because the share market crash basically changed the market overnight. So, people's discretionary spending just stopped in New Zealand, because our client base was high net worth individuals who worked in advertising or worked in the banking sector, and all of a sudden they they didn't have as much money as they used to have because their
Schumacher crash, was that an event in
share
New Zealand?
market. Share market.
Schumacher, okay.
No,
Sorry.
The share market. Share market. Bonds and stocks and stock market.
Stock market, okay. And that would have been in 2000?
That was, it was in the 90s. I can't remember.
Okay, 91, 92.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And then once that happened, you said that the business started really kind of slow down. And so when did you at some point say, look, this isn't for me, I want to try something different?
Well, whilst I had that business, every morning I'd sit in the office and I'd do the paperwork, send out the invoices, and then I would go downstairs, set the boys up with what they had to work on for the day, etc. I was very hands-on myself, but before I went down and started, I would go and have my lunch, which was kind of a late morning tea down at one of the local cafes. So I became a regular there, and this was kind of the event of specialty coffee in New Zealand, which was very, very early compared to the rest of the world. And I would go down and I got to know them in the cafe from going down there most mornings and having coffee and something to eat before I went back to the workshop. So this was a very successful coffee roasting cafe business. They were selling coffee all around New Zealand at the time, and they were in the process of buying a new site in downtown Wellington. And they said to me, look, Andrew, do you want to come along and run this restaurant for us? And I was sort of, I've come from the car background. Fortunately, my wife, Nicky, had done a lot of work in hospitality. So I went home and I said, we've got this opportunity to open a restaurant cafe downtown. And she was a little bit reluctant at first because she knew how much hard work it was. It's a
young man's game, they say.
Sorry?
The restaurant business is a young man's game, is what I've heard.
Yes and no. The staff is certainly a young staff, but I don't know that it's necessarily a young man's game. I think some of the better restaurants have got, older proprietors that do a really, really great job, because they know the industry inside out. So we went into this business. I saw it as kind of, in a way, necessity. We could have struggled along with the car business, which was called the Toy Shop at the time. And we could have struggled along with that for a number of years, I'm sure. But it was like, hang on, there's not a great future in this. We need something else. So we went into that for the next 15 odd years. Built a business that we were an inner city bistro, and we looked after our big business was inner city suits coming in for lunch, and then we'd have a dinner service after. But beyond that, we built that business up, had a very good reputation. In the year we sold that, we were nominated Best Bistro for the country. So it was quite an achievement. Sorry, what?
Which city are you in?
Wellington.
Wellington, sorry.
Yeah.
Capital. So you were learning the business, but these are all entrepreneurial. Like there was some entrepreneurial business, understanding customers, understanding demand, service. I mean, can you tell me about what you learned in these years? Because this is all formative.
I guess
it seems like it would have been formative for you.
I guess it was no different than the car business, really. You still had to provide a good level of service. It was just slightly different, and you didn't have grease under your fingernails. So it was what you were. I guess in any business, I think shares the same fundamentals in a way of There's not many businesses where customer service is not king, that you've really got to look after your final customer. And certainly a restaurant's that's more in your face, but working with a restaurant, working in a restaurant, at the end of it, and a busy service when the place is just really humming is just such a feeling of satisfaction when you've got a great team of people working with you, for you, and they're doing a great job. It's a fantastic feeling. So, yeah, you learn about delivering customer expectations, I guess. So when you go into a restaurant, I've always said there's three parts to dining. There's obviously the food, which has to be good. There's obviously the service that has to be good. And then there's the ambience. And I don't think a great restaurant really operates without those three parts almost in equal proportion. When you look at really memorable meals you've had, was it only because the food was so fantastic? I'm not so sure. When the food and the service are great, perhaps you overlook the ambience, and it's a little bit different here in Italy, but certainly in other major cities in the world, most restaurants, the ambience is a big part of their formula. So we had quite a beautiful place. It was a beautiful room, big chandeliers, lovely wood panelling, and some very, very competent staff.
Do you own the business?
Yeah. So we started off with 3 couples being involved, and we ended up with actually 2 couples involved. Yeah. Us and another couple who were hands off.
How working with your wife in this time?
Well, we've worked a lot together since. Look, it was fine. I think we've from an early stage we decided that somebody's got to be the boss in that part of the business, and somebody's got to be the boss in that part of the business. We kept the car business for about a year, so there was a transition when Nicky largely ran the restaurant, and then we got to a stage where the restaurant was going gangbusters. Okay, well, let's get out of the car, sell the car business, and devote our time entirely to the restaurant business. So when Nick was there, she was the boss. She predominantly did the breakfast and the lunch service, and she was the boss, and I was just the boy on the floor. And then at night, she was at home, and I was doing the dinner service. So I was in charge then, because she wasn't there, of course. She ran the kitchen, that side of looked after the chefs, because we had about 6 chefs on a shift. It was a pretty big place. And then I did all the wine list and that kind of thing. So we split the business to departments. So there was overlap, but she had autonomy in certain areas of the business, and I in other.
Sounds great. Working together with family that close, being able to make it work must be really fulfilling. So yeah, congratulations on that.
Thank you. I think it can be difficult, but if you set it up correctly, I think it's fine, And sure, like everything, you bring too much work into your home life, but because that becomes what you're both doing all day long, so that can be a bit of a challenge managing that.
So then we get to what everybody's kind of waiting for here. Is the matter of Rocket. And I know I with you briefly about this, and the only window into that in our conversations was that you had owned a restaurant and you were distributing coffee machines, or had some business with these coffee machines, and then became interested in this opportunity. So maybe can you tell us more about where you went from the restaurant to actually moving your whole family to Italy?
Okay.
And
so
a bankrupt coffee machine business?
So what happened there, whilst we had the restaurant, one of the original partners in the restaurant business had been from, obviously, it was the cafe that I talked about previously that I would go down for my morning tea. So they were one of the partners, and they'd since exited that business, but we still kept in touch and became pretty good friends. They were the importer into New Zealand of a machine called the ECM Giotto, okay, which was the machine the company we ended up buying. Now, Jeff, who's very entrepreneurial, very clever, I think he was the first person to bring Birkenstocks into New Zealand years ago. So he's always had an eye for the unusual, probably way before its time. Jeff was bringing a domestic espresso machine into New Zealand and doing very well with it. He didn't like the name ECM Giotto, so he called it in New Zealand the Rocket. Fast forward a number of years, Jeff came to me one day and said, I think ECM in Italy is having trouble because I can't get any more machines. He said, I think they're in financial trouble. Why don't we try and buy it? And Nick and I had been to Italy on a couple of family holidays and really, really loved being here. And I don't know, for whatever reason, we kind of kept toying with the idea of how can we move to Italy? What would we have to do to make a living? Should we buy a B&B? Should we, buy a laundromat? How could we do something that would enable us to...
Okay, but I want to stop you for a second, Andrew. This seems really normal to you to want to do this, but this is unique. I think the way that you and your wife think about just moving to Italy from New Zealand. To me, it's unique. Yeah. But it sounds like it's just the way that you guys think.
I don't know. Maybe it is. I think there's a bunch of people. You've come from the US. You know that. How many people do you run into and they go, "Yeah, I'd love to live in Italy. God, it must be a dream," but they don't do it because
no, that's the thing.
Yeah, because your comfort zone's a very comfortable place to be. That's why it's your comfort zone.
It is, and that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
and I'm glad you understand that there is a provincial tendency in all of us, and comfort and wanting to be close to where we're from because that is comfortable. And some people, you and I included, have some sort of adventurous to them, I guess. Ignorance, maybe.
And sometimes I think it's a naivety, to be honest. Sometimes yes, I think it's
that's what I meant.
A little bit. Sometimes the restaurant was a great business. It was going fantastically well. We had a fantastic standard of living. We lived in a lovely home. There was. If you stood back and looked at our life at that time, you'd go, "Hang on, what's wrong with this picture?" Absolutely nothing. Okay, the only thing was Nick worked days and I worked nights. We were fortunate enough that the restaurant wasn't open on a Saturday night and we didn't do Sundays at all. So we did have a bit of family life then, but she was basically bringing up Felix, who was one at the time we opened the restaurant, and had dinner with him every night, till the time we sold that business. So that was a little bit of a juggle. And other than that, life was great. Life was perfect. And so
I think it's really. I would say it's insane that you guys would have considered and then gone to Italy with your family. You had a successful business, probably generated any of cash for your family. You were comfortable to go and buy a bankrupt coffee machine company in Italy.
Yeah, I don't know, but I guess came over here, did some. Look, I guess you'd call it due diligence, but it was very, very amateur, basic due diligence. Had a look around and went, yeah, I think we can make a go of this. I guess we knew the product very well in New Zealand. We knew it was a great product in New Zealand. We used the product in New Zealand at home, so we kind of believed in what we were buying. However, probably the harder part to it all was the fact that the market was probably bigger in Australasia at the time, and globally, some of the markets weren't developed at all. So when you looked at New Zealand and Australia and go, these machines sell like hotcakes, we can do this. This is fine. And then you get over there and you go, hang on. A lot of these markets are so naive and don't really understand domestic espresso because it's in its infancy. And so that was a little bit of an eye-opener then. And buying a bankrupt business, they weren't quite bankrupt. We bought the intellectual property to build the domestic home machines, and they carried on building commercial machines for another probably a year at the most before they failed entirely. But so we got this IP and we got their customer base, which, on paper looked fantastic. But when you started calling up these customers all around the world, the bridges were more broken than I thought they would be. There wasn't a lot of trust by a lot of these dealers. And then a New Zealander turns up in Italy and he's going to build espresso machines. I think most of them just put the phone down and laughed at me. It's like, why are we going to buy? The guy's bankrupt. We haven't had any honesty from the company for a good year. And now a New Zealander's turned up and it's going to turn this around. So there was a lot of fires to put out, a lot of broken bridges. But at that point, there was me and Daniele Berenbrock, who was a son of the original owner of the business. So we bought the IP, we bought a handful of the material to build some machines, and Daniele came with the business. And that was very fortunate because Daniele was a great business partner to have. He really understood the other side of the business, so we were complementary.
The manufacturing.
Yeah, manufacturing, procurement of material, etc., etc. So we had two very different skill sets, and that was fantastic. So I would start off.
Daniele was 50% or minor?
At that stage, he was a very, very minor shareholder, and Jeff from New Zealand, from the original cafe business, he was still a partner at that point. Jeff exited the business soon after that, and it became Daniele and I. And originally it was just two of us in an office with a computer each, and all the production was outsourced. And very quickly we started our own factory, but it was like, our first employee, our second employee, it was very much just like, wasn't all of a sudden we've got 20 people and thousands of machines going out the door. It was nothing like that. It was just very much building a brand from the basics and trying to build it out with a lot of trying to build it out solidly from the base up, and we were fortunate enough that you would only have to gear up, you'd only have to do more when the time came. So we were growing very fast and we could just take on employees, take on a new employee, take on a new employee. But, I guess that's very different than walking in tomorrow to the factory and going, okay, now we've got to pay the wages for 50 people. That's quite different when you're new starting off.
So it was a really lean business at the beginning.
Yeah, I'm probably too much the master of lean. I just can't stand seeing wastage in a business, and maybe that's coming from a restaurant business, or maybe that's even the lessons learned when in the car business when the share market changes came in. That prior to that, there was a big bag of cash every night sitting on the workshop floor, and you'd go out and spend it at restaurants, drinks, blah, blah, blah. We were young, we just had a great time. And then all of a sudden, overnight, a switch turned, and it was like, hang on, I wish I'd kept some of that pile of cash, for a rainy day, because we've now got a rainy day. So, and I think that was a very, very big lesson to me about running a business and actually just, building that business, not being wasteful, it's very easy to get carried away, but I'd go into the factory and go, what are these doing here? Why do we have 150 panels from a machine we're not building anymore, sort of thing? That was wrong. We needed to finish that line and, down to the last nut, bolt and screw. So that's kind of just inherently me, I guess.
No, I totally that's really interesting in a sense that you're saying be successful. You had a very prudent approach to keeping the way that you're ramping it up very lean, very optimized. And this has been obviously a successful strategy that you've kept throughout. So you were ramping up, it sounds like, starting with this office with you and Daniele, outsourcing the production. And as demand began to ramp up, you were able to sort of scale up with the network. But you don't speak Italian.
No.
That's crazy.
Well, yeah, I guess that's one of the problems with living with a New Zealander. Okay, I don't have an Italian wife, so we come home and we speak English. At Rocket, my part of the business was either was the design of the machine, the aesthetic of the machine, not the internal design. The aesthetic of the machine, the branding, the marketing, and then sales predominantly to most countries around the world. Daniele spoke German, and he looked after the German market, which grew to be a massive, massive market for us. So I lived in this kind of English bubble. 90% of the time I'd be speaking or emailing in English, and then I'd come home and I'd be speaking in English, of course. So, yeah, and maybe you can't teach old dogs new tricks, but yeah, so I still struggle with the language.
So tell me so you ramped up the business, and can you tell me how cycling was part of the strategy?
Okay, cycling wasn't really part of the strategy. We didn't wake up one morning and go, okay, we're going to be the next Red Bull. We're going to sponsor every sporting event under the sun and build a brand around that. So obviously I had a background in bike racing. I loved bike racing. The whole family loves bike racing. Our son Felix races for a German continental team. So we watch every race on the television. We go to a lot of bike races and stand on the side of the road. And you and I have bumped into each other in those very places. So what happened is Rocket was still a new machine, a new brand, because we started in 2000 and sort of late 2007, so we didn't really start, I guess, properly to 2008. In 2009, we were sitting around having a sales meeting. We had another salesperson at that stage, but we're still a pretty small company. And I sort of said, maybe we should build a machine to celebrate the Giro d'Italia this year because it's 100 years old. Just a throwaway idea like I always do. And everyone, the others who weren't cycling fans at all, went, yeah, that's a fantastic idea. Yeah, brilliant, let's do it. And I thought, okay, well, if they think it's a good idea, because they're quite conservative really in their thinking about branding, we'll give it a go. So we built 100 machines to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Giro. This was the 100 years, not 100 editions, because obviously they lost some over the time of the wars. It was the year Dennis Menchoff won it. We built these 100 machines, and it was the first custom machine we did. Down the side panel, there were 100 editions, 100 names engraved into the side panel. We put a pink manometer, pressure gauge on the machine, and some other kind of nice features to celebrate this. We had a special box made with a pink stripe around it. Menchoff crossed the line, and that year, winning the race, we went out and bought 100 of the Gazzetta dello Sport newspapers, which summarised the race on that final day. Put that inside the box, with the machine, and they all had numbered plates on them, 1 to 100. Put that inside the machine box and shipped it. The reaction from the customer base was already at that stage was surprisingly good, and I guess they were looking for something that had a point of difference, something special. And some dealers took a few machines. It was like, oh, this is quite surprising. And we sold them all pretty easily. And at the same time, that led to probably what really started to cement our tie-up in cycling was I contacted Rafa and said, look, we've just created this machine. I'll give you one to offer in a competition. They said, oh, can we have two? Because we want one for the office. So they got two of these machines. But
this is like you're understating it. This is how you guys really entered in the zeitgeist of cycling.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can understate how interesting this is, because people know in the business how much it costs to be around cycling teams, because cycling teams are kind of the pinnacle of athletes, of athleticism, the visibility. And have your product around those people, invisible with those people, is extremely hard to do. And it sounds like you just were in the right place at the right time with the right product.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
I guess so, yeah. So, what happened then, of course, is Rafa were really making, in 2009, Rafa were, really on the upward trajectory. And we obviously got exposed to their whole customer base at that point. And that led to a lot of brand awareness within cycling. From that, bike riders would call me up and say, World Tour riders would call me up and say, oh, Andrew, I'd really like to get a machine. And so we started, I called it a brand ambassador program, but it was pretty basic. A rider got a discount. Rider wanted a machine, he got a discount machine and would ship it out to them. And he had to take, a couple of pictures of him making coffee on his machine, on a very, I think, we're only talking a few years ago, but this was obviously prior to, I don't know what year Instagram started, but it was prior to that. There was no kind of brand ambassadors were a different beast in those days. And people were kind of, they didn't hold out their hand for the cash value of their worth necessarily. I'm not saying we exploited anybody, but I just find that today you've got a brand influencer who one day is showing his espresso machine, and the next day is showing his chainsaw, and the next day is showing his car wash product or something ridiculous, and it's like,
it was more organic back then.
Yeah, to me it felt like these guys really wanted to. World Tour cycling is big into coffee now, or the World Tour, bike riders are big into coffee now. That wasn't the case in 2009. Absolutely not. These guys were, oh yeah, okay, I want to get into this. And I look at the setups now that some of these bike riders have got. It's like, sheesh, you've spent some money on that piece of kit. That's got some beautiful setups, and they're really into their coffee. I would think in the next few years, I'm sure there's some that do have involvements in coffee roasters and things like that, and I'm sure that's going to be. No, we're not going to be surprised by that happening more and more, because some of these guys are, really into their coffee, surprisingly so.
So it's just between cycling and the product itself. And there was a macro trend of home espresso machines, the growth of coffee in general, that you were able to kind of catch the wave as well.
Yeah, I think the home espresso market, as I alluded to earlier, was, when we took over the company, was pretty, it was very basic. The German market existed, but it wasn't very strong, and that's grown into the biggest market in the world. The US was really in its infancy, so you had two of the major markets in the world being in their infancy. And now, look, the Rocket dealership basically extends throughout the world. There's hardly a country that doesn't have a Rocket dealer anymore. And that certainly wasn't the case. It was heavily concentrated on Australasia and a little bit happening in North America. Canada was pretty strong, and Germany was okay, but the UK was almost no machines a year, and that I don't know what they're doing today in the UK, but it grew. All these markets grew to quite decent sized markets.
And I know I've seen throughout the industry to have a raw machine in your headquarters is sort of a standard.
Yeah, well, that
so
was
you guys.
That was an extension of the brand ambassador program. Then what would happen is companies would call up and say, "Oh, can we get a machine?" And sure, yeah. So we just kept building it out from that point, just through the love of being associated with the coolest sport in the world. It was as simple as
so
that.
There wasn't intentionality there. It was just you liking it going.
Yeah, and I'm a bit odd in the fact that perhaps I'm not very commercially savvy, in the fact that we could have built it out to other sports, but I just felt that if I've got if we build it out to other sports and I don't know who won the Ironman or who won the World Triathlon Championships or who won the 1,500 metres at the World Athletic Championships, what right have I got to be in that space? I've got to be able to say to my customer, yeah, no, I saw the Milan-San Remo, so-and-so attacked on the Poggio and won the race, or whatever it is. I just felt that I'm all about credibility, I guess, and that's probably to a detriment, but I just didn't feel comfortable selling into sports I knew nothing about. It's not to say we absolutely not, but we didn't really develop into those areas, and we possibly could have, but I didn't really see any necessity to. I'd rather be one thing to one group of people and be there all in and encompassing, rather than something to everybody and not really having any stronghold there.
Well, and there's definitely something to be said about having an expression of a partnership being genuine that increases the quality of the partnership, is the quality of the communication around. So I feel like that's a really smart way to do it, because when you do get into other areas, it sort of dilutes and makes it harder for you to have a clear message.
But I think, I agree that I think if you have a total commitment and you have a total belief in what you're doing, your brand, your marketing, your messaging, it is a lot stronger. I remember picking up a packet of biscuits one day that had this beautiful image, evoked this family, and the tradition of baking, and I was really interested, and I turned the packet over, and it was just a glossy photo put on the packet of biscuits, and I was just so disappointed, because I wanted to be drawn into the story. I wanted to be part of that family, that image. And I guess you look at what Rafa did originally with cycle clothing. They told that story beautifully. Everybody wanted to ride that bike up that wooded climb. No one didn't want to do it, and that was early 2000s or 2010 or something, and everybody wanted to be part of that story. Now, what, 20 years later, 10 years, 12, 15 years later, whatever it is, everybody's doing the same thing. But, and they owned that space and wanted to take us on that journey. How beautiful was that?
Yeah, it came from Simon Muckram.
Yeah, exactly.
That's amazing. Yes, cycling, I'm talking to a lot of people, Andrew, and there's this incredibly powerful emotional connection with this sport. And people will, they'll sacrifice potential earnings to be in this business just because there's something romantic about it, about the competition, about the elegance of it. And I don't know, I'm just digging deeper into it here. This is like I'm reflecting on this right now in real time. But it's been a great journey to talk to all these people. And what you just said about your belief in the sport and your belief in getting behind the products because you do believe in them, I think is a really beautiful intersection of commerce and passion that, fortunately, for people that work in this business can experience.
I guess what has happened to which has been very, very fortunate for cycling is, all these people, it's the new golf. So, when I was racing a bike, it was a totally European sport. When in '82, when I came to Italy, no one else rode a bike in New Zealand. It was just a handful of us, and we all knew each other. And now, if you go back to New Zealand, every second businessman's got a bike and is going out and doing a few miles, which has been fantastic for the sport. So, and that's brought in a way, way bigger audience, hasn't it?
Yeah, and a healthy sport, it's a fun sport, so there's nothing wrong with more people being involved with it. I think it's positive all around.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you had this cycle of businesses that you're being involved in. You started with the mechanic, the shop, the restaurant, then Rocket. And at a certain point, you exited Rocket.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. Well, in 2018, we were approached by one of the big manufacturers of espresso machines, mainly commercial machines, and they wanted to buy Rocket. They had quite a large portfolio, mainly in, as I say, building commercial machines for bars and cafes, and they saw Rocket in their words, as a sexy brand, and they wanted to add it on to their business. I was a little bit older than Daniele, our business partner, and there was always in the back of my mind, when I want to exit, Daniele won't be ready to exit, and then he's going to have to perhaps buy me out. He's never really going to have the cash to be able to do that, so I'll have to leave money in, and I wasn't necessarily comfortable leaving my money in the business and being paid out over a number of years. So selling the business was always in the back of my mind. Nothing against his ability to run the business by himself. He's still there and he does a fantastic job, but we had very different skills, as I said earlier, and I just felt that the brand without me might be slightly different. Anyway, so they made an offer and we accepted their offer and sold the business, and I stayed on for another couple of years with them.
That was something that you had always kind of had in the cards.
I guess in the back of my mind, yeah. Having.
So now you're not involved with the business anymore.
No, not at all. I still have a little bit to do with them. I still people still contact me and from the cycling industry, whether it be a rider or other, and can I get a machine sort of thing. So I still help out, trying to keep the name alive within cycling circles, and they've still done a little bit in bike racing circles. I did a project just as I was leaving for them with Rafa to do another limited edition release. And that was about in 2020, and we did another, I think it was 100 machines again for Rafa, and signed that off. But no, I don't really have much to do with the business anymore at all. Which is quite sad in a way, but that's what happens. Most founders, I think most founders, inevitably move on from the business they sell.
So a little bit of regret.
I wouldn't say it's regret. I wouldn't say it's regret, but it's kind of a sadness when you give everything, but you make, that's a decision you make, obviously, and so there's no regret there with the decision, but I guess there's a sadness. It was very, very hard leaving the company, to be honest with you.
It was your baby.
Yeah, exactly. I struggled with emotionally. I struggled with the exit. It was tough because not that I necessarily wanted to stay any longer because I'd made that decision and I didn't regret that decision, but just leaving it all behind, what we'd built and those staff that had come on from day one and worked with us since 2007 who were still there. There was a huge a bond, and I was very grateful for their work and their effort in coming on that journey to build what became, in my view, the best espresso machine in the world. So that was really quite something.
So now we're a pattern. So assuming this will take us into the next project. I know you were doing some roasting for a while immediately after you sold the business. I don't know if you're still doing that or not, but I know that you're working with box altitude well.
Yeah. So the roasting project was a bit of fun when we still had Rocket and we were selling to a few customers around Europe, freshly roasted coffee. But that kind of, when I exited, that didn't really ever continue. So it was a bit of fun at the time, and I still roast coffee for us at home, so keep my hand in. Then box altitude, yeah, that's a guy out of Melbourne in Australia, Rico Rogers. He rode professionally for teams like Balku, and I can't remember what year. He was a sprint, pretty good at his level. And Rico had dabbled with altitude systems when he was a bike rider and always been really, really disappointed in how they worked, how comfortable they were. So he set about reinventing the category, I guess, and has really gone to town on, as I say, reinventing that category. Most athletes you talk about say, yeah, I've tried altitude, it was claustrophobic, it was too hot, it was this, that, noisy, blah, blah, blah. So Rico, having used it, went, well, these are all major problems. So, and consequently, an athlete gets altitude but doesn't get a good night's sleep. So I need to throw all these old ideas out and build something else, which he's done.
Can you just let people know what exactly box altitude does?
Okay, so we build altitude hypoxic chambers, so systems for either training or sleeping at altitude. So you go into a tent environment, or even better, you turn your whole bedroom into an altitude space. It's controlled by an app on your phone, so you dial in the altitude you want to sleep at, which is generally, for most people, around 2,000 meters. You dial in.
Is there a machine that lowers the level of oxygen in the room?
Yeah. So then the machine takes out the oxygen. So you've got less oxygen being pumped into the space, and that's what gives you, obviously, sleeping at altitude. Generally, sleeping at altitude's considered a 3 to 4% gain in performance, which is massive. So you think of the podium of a Grand Tour cycle race, for instance. 4%. If you're 4% behind the winner, if you get 4% more out of your performance, well, that's a fundamental change. Yeah. So, what it's doing is it's increasing the EPO production, which was the famous, blood manipulation that was done in the 90s and the Armstrong era, but it's doing it legally. So, and it's the same as now a lot of, especially bike racing teams, again, they spend a lot of time training in the mountains, sleeping and training at altitude. So this does it in the comfort of your own home, which is a big plus. And a lot of teams don't have the budget, to necessarily take a team up there for
Sure.
month on month, so you can sleep at home and get exactly the same benefit.
And how's everything going?
It's good. We're making great headway into professional cycling. In fact, from the recent Tour de France, 2 out of the 3 people on the podium were using systems. Had a relationship with the company, so that was good. We've been official partners with Jumbo Visma for the last 2 years. We're working with several other teams. One of the big problems with altitude, unlike espresso machines, is everybody wants to show you their espresso machine on their kitchen bench and how good they are at making espresso. But with an altitude system, they don't want to tell anybody they've got a system. So there's word of mouth is really quite tough. So
Wow.
It's a whole different set of challenges. You've got a very similar product that is in a way premium. It's niche market, but you can try on Instagram, but you can try and promote the brand, but you just don't get that chatter about the brand behind the scenes, which is the best advertising you can ever do. If somebody's had a great espresso machine experience, they just want to tell their next door neighbour and their friends, come over and have a coffee, make the best coffee in the street, sort of thing. Whereas no athlete's going to say, well, I'm riding 4% faster because I've got this altitude tent that I'm now sleeping in. Even between teams, I don't think
it's very personal.
Yeah, it is. They want to keep their edge. So that does make it different. As I say, we're doing very well in cycling. Some of the other sports are a little bit slower for us to break into, but then obviously our contact base is primarily cycling because of our background. So that's a much easier market. The wellness category is very, very interesting too, especially in California. People wanting to live longer, and altitude is part of that whole gig where, that if you're sleeping at altitude, the health benefits are really interesting too, what it's doing for longevity.
And so are you doing day-to-day work on this, or is this something that's part-time, or how involved are you in this?
It's for me, it's part-time. So, Rico basically runs a business out of Australia. I've become involved, I guess, to put a more commercial slant on the business to try and develop the European market. Australia's a long way from this market. So, but it's a part-time job for me. But it's really interesting getting to talk to some really interesting people and learning about, a whole subject matter that I knew nothing about, really.
It's amazing to be able to talk to people in this business. I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of people, and it's a huge benefit of the work that we do.
Yeah, exactly. It's it's a great industry, and sport in general. I wouldn't say I'm the biggest sport in general fan, but I do love seeing high performance athletes doing really, really well. That's it's pretty cool.
Andrew, thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure.
I really appreciate your time. I think this was fun. We really hit some interesting points. And so if people want to reach out to you and learn more about box altitude, I know that you want to give us some information about where they can find more information about it.
Yeah, sure. Well, obviously it's boxaltitude.com. And anyone can get hold of me through, I guess the easiest way these days is my Instagram account, which is just Andrew Meo, M-E-O. So, yeah, but brilliant. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you again, Andrew, and you take care. Hopefully we'll see each other race.
Yeah, be good. Okay, thanks, Wyatt. Bye-bye.